Hi, everyone. This is Dorcas Chang-Tozen, editor with PAX. We are currently in a story arc on migration, where we are learning about migration as an inherent part of the human experience. And we're taking a closer look at how God loves and identifies with migrants. And that last point is really what we're delving into in our material path point, which is the spiritual heart of each of our story arcs. Our material path point statement is God honors the migrant journey and the humanity of all migrants. Rather than being on the margins, as they often are in our societies, migrants are very much at the center of God's heart and what he is doing in the world. I'm joined today by an incredible panel of talented, dedicated professionals who are the hands and feet of Jesus when it comes to serving and honoring the immigrants among us. I'm so pleased to introduce to you Blanca Castillo, Migrant Shelter Coordinator of Abara Borderland Connections, Guillermo Torres, the Immigration Program Director for Clergy Laity United for Economic Justice, and Jonathan Fung, the Director of Legal Services for the Immigration Resource Center of San Gabriel Valley. We'll be discussing what they do, what they've learned along the way, and how they have been personally transformed by their work. I'd like to ask each panelist to begin by just telling us a little bit more about what their organization does and what their role is within that. So let's start with Blanca, and then Guillermo, and then Jonathan.
Thank you, Dorcas. Well, like you said, I represent the organization Abara Borderland Connections. We are based out of El Paso, Texas, and we engage in humanitarian assistance, across and over the border. We basically support the network of migrant shelters both in El Paso and in its sister city of Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, in Mexico. We have been doing that for the past 2 years, and even a little before then, ever since the implementation of the stay or remain in Mexico policy under the past administration. We basically assist the migrant shelters by connecting with the directors, connecting with all the other NGOs and state actors that are present in the city, to basically assess what the needs are and improve the living standards for those shelters. We also do a bit of case management and working in support of other legal organizations in the area to kind of spot out and identify specific cases and referring them. We've also been able to kind of do accompaniments throughout cases for just kind of like social services support. And we also do a couple social programs for women and children in the shelters. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. Guillermo.
Well, our organization runs many different programs to help immigrants and be in that space of advocacy with them together, from educating congregations around asylum seekers and why are they coming and why are they fleeing, from recruiting congregations to become sponsors of asylum seekers. That's one of our programs. It's called the Shelter in Place. In addition to training congregations and recruiting them and training them to sponsor asylum seekers or other immigrants and unaccompanied minors, we also train people to visit immigrants at the Adelanto Detention Center, so they could be in that space of pain and suffering, and that the immigrants will not feel abandoned because some of them have no family to come and see them at those horrific detention centers. So that's another component of our work, training folks from different faiths, different backgrounds to go visit immigrants at the detention center here in Adelanto and in other facilities. In addition to that, we have a program where we organize legal clinics for immigrants, so that way it could bring kind of a equity to immigrants, because most of them cannot afford legal consultations, which are very expensive. So our legal clinics, we recruit between 5 to 10 lawyers. We do these clinics about twice a month, and we're able to bring some kind of equity to immigrants to see if they might have a way to apply for some kind of status. So we have legal clinics that we do. And in addition to that, we train congregations who want to start a program around be an immigration resource center at their congregation. So we form strategic partners with congregations as consultants to help them start the program going in the congregations, right? We just began one with the United Methodist Church in Echo Park right now. So we serve as consultants and also as strategic partners to get them going from the ground up. And in addition to that, we educating congregations. We also do advocacy and train faith communities to be that prophetic action, to be that prophetic witness out there in those spaces. And lastly, we back in 2014, we created the UCARE Coalition to work with unaccompanied minors and we built a whole network of about 50 orgs, community orgs, legal orgs, faith orgs, local government officials to respond to the crisis, to respond to the need of the unaccompanied minors to feel welcome and give them resources to help them with their asylum cases. Yeah, that's just some of the work that we cover.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan.
All right. So the Immigration Resource Center of San Gabriel Valley is actually a church-based ministry located out of Monrovia. So the church that we're embedded under is Mountainside Communion. It's a Nazarene church. And even though we are a nonprofit legal services provider and we're a distinct organization that focuses on that, the way that we are structured and the way that we are set up is when the church started providing help for the local community in 2012, when DACA first came out, and a lot of parents started engaging with the church through normal church programs. You would find like after school tutoring, collaborations with both a Latino church that's located on the same grounds and also the Monrovia Boys and Girls Club. The church discovered that a lot of parents and a lot of community members actually were undocumented and needed help with DACA and were coming out in droves to get help from Know Your Rights clinics, from application clinics. And that's when Mountainside Communion decided that this was a calling, that the best way to engage their neighbors was to turn this into a longer term ministry. And so they hired a pastor or can they commission one of their pastors to actually go through the process of becoming Department of Justice accredited, which allows him to give legal advice on immigration. We became a recognized organization by the Department of Justice. And so now we're able to use both attorneys and trained non-attorney legal representatives to provide direct representation and legal services. So what we mainly do is we service, I'd say our main core constituency are the family members of San Gabriel Valley. There's a huge immigrant population here. If you look at the statistics for LA County, you'll see that there's probably over 1 million people that are undocumented. And there are a good proportion, over 30% of them that are married to U.S. citizens that have U.S. citizen children, and they exist in this this bubble where they are part of the community but not fully integrated. And so we view that as a hurdle that we want to help them overcome. We provide services for people who are currently legal permanent residents and applying for naturalization. We help for people who are undocumented, but they have those family members that could possibly provide them a path to some sort of immigration status. And we help survivors of different types of crime, including domestic violence, other serious crimes that are considered by the government to provide a pathway towards legal status here in the U.S. And those, I would say, are our 3 core constituencies for our services.
Thank you so much. I just love hearing about the wide array of ways in which you all are serving immigrants and our communities. Jonathan, I was hoping you could share with us what you see as the greatest challenges that immigrants coming to the U.S. today face.
Yeah, I feel like that is a really big question because there are so many types of ways that people become immigrants and people immigrate to the U.S. But for the population I just described, a lot of family members who are just living here in the U.S. and been here for decades and don't have a pathway to legal status, I would say the greatest challenge is that the law has been increasingly restrictive on closing down pathways to legal status, and people are not able to take advantage of any sort of pathways to becoming a permanent resident. And I think that there is intuitively a assumption that there would be some sort of pathway. You see comments all the time like, well, if you've been here such a long time, why didn't you apply for citizenship? But I think the reality that people don't recognize is we've deliberately crafted laws that have changed over time so that people in the same situation that we would have assumed a generation ago to be able to immigrate legally are no longer able to do that. For example, my own family, I had a grandfather who received a sponsorship from an employer, but he was just an uneducated tailor. And that is not something that you could really see happen today. We always talk about there being primary ways to immigrate, 3 primary ways to immigrate to the US: blood, sweat, or tears. And if you don't have the close family connections through blood, if you don't have the, if you don't have something that you can contribute in terms of wealth or the capacity to generate a lot of wealth for the US, you can't come through the employment pathway. And finally, it's extremely difficult to obtain asylum. And I think the other panelists can really talk about that more. But as a very short example, one of our staff members went down during the caravan, the migrant caravan that was coming up in 2019, and was helping do know your rights sort of screenings for asylum seekers. And she was talking to a pastor from El Salvador who was mentioning that gang members had approached him and told him that he would have to evacuate his church, that they would be taking it over if they found him to still be there after a week, that they would kill him. And she recognized that probably alone would not be grounds for asylum. It's not an issue of credibility. It's not an issue of whether or not you're actually threatened, but it's an issue of whether you belong in these very, very narrow categories that make you eligible or not. Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or particular social group. And being threatened just for your property, regardless of how true that threat is, didn't qualify. And so I think a lot of people intuitively misunderstand how these situations that we would want to bring immigrants, want to extend pathways for migration, are actually not real under our current law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for explaining that so well, Jonathan. Blanca, I know you all are very much on the front lines at the border, seeing people who are trying to come into the US. What do you see as the greatest challenges that they're facing?
Well, I think that to kind of supplement what Jonathan had been saying, our current US asylum system is not as, I could say, like adequate or complicit with like the realities of today. So we see like a system that is structured after certain victims of certain crimes, then you have to fit under those categories. And we are seeing like people migrating in hordes up from Latin America that are experiencing just as horrendous and just as traumatic experiences, but without any actual protections that they could seek under US law. So I think for us, like the biggest challenge has been informing, like providing people with the correct information for a lot of the families that are coming over here. The biggest challenge is root causes. I think that the US, especially like when political officials are creating these policies, immigration policy is all under the executive branch, so it's constantly being rewritten with every 4 years or every new administration. So you never have like a very coherent piece of law that applies to all. So it's kind of the way that we've described it. It's like a woven blanket, and everyone's using like a different kind of stitch pattern each term. And sometimes that just doesn't make sense. And sometimes that can cause gaps in the systems where lots of people that are truly victimized by the circumstances that they're living will never be able to receive any protection. And then there's others who do. So I think that's been like the misinformation on the side to like asylum seekers themselves who get misinformed by coyotes or people who are trying to take advantage of them and throughout the whole migration trajectory or journey. You see a lot of misinformation from organized crime groups, but also like with the US government. I think people making these policies are not thinking about the whole picture, or the US's, I'd say like the US's responsibility in causing a lot of these factors. I would say that a lot of today's problems in Latin America do have a root in US policies that have affected them from decades before. And we're just now seeing the consequences of those policies. And so I think for us, it's really been getting like the correct information to these families. I think it's been educating people creating the policies. I think it's like really reawakening like America to understanding like the full impact that these policies will have, and also seeing it beyond like certain numbers or statistics, but the families that are actually going to be impacted, which is again like the humanity of it all.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue to what I wanted to talk about next, because I think it can be tempting to keep this a very academic discussion, right, about policies and politics, but really we're talking about people, real families that are being seriously affected. And so, Guillermo, I'd love to hear from you. You know, your organization works with so many different people. Is there a story that kind of sticks out to you of an immigrant or an immigrant family that you've encountered or your organization has worked with, just to kind of help us put a face to the kinds of experiences that immigrants go through to try to come to the U.S.?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of stories that we have, and I want to just add something real quick to what you were the question you were asking right now. That, you know, when we fail to see the humanity of an immigrant, we fail to see God, and that is the absence of love, and the absence that you can have no sense of humanity, compassion, and justice. And if you are disconnected from an immigrant, and when we talk about these policies, the issue is that I compare it to grace versus the law, where in my tradition, where in Jesus' days, they were complaining about him not following the law, but Christ was all about grace. So policies that have do not, and even in my community, evangelical or Pentecostal community, where they demonize immigrants, I don't like it when you associate God with my God with no sense of humanity, compassion, and justice, and the truth. So if you are disconnected from your neighbor, as God said, the biggest commandment is love God and then your neighbor, you are disconnected from God, and it's the absence of love. And with that, to your question about some of these stories I had one lady who had fled El Salvador because they had killed her son-in-law in front of them in the patio of the gangs. And that was one of the most, and then she shared with us at a congregation the journey to free El Salvador from the gangs, because they were threatening to murder all of them because they were sorry about that. Something here is interrupting they were threatening to murder the whole family because they were witnesses. So they fled, right? And then when she recounted, and this was a grandmother, and when she recounted the story about what the journey to escape and to seek refuge, and it was so graphic and describing that in Mexico, whether her family was in Mexico, and her daughter and her son-in-law, they were robbed at gunpoint at one time by the gangs or the cartels in Mexico, or criminal gangs. And at one time, she said that these cops took them and transported them from one place to another, and the place that they brought them to a place in Mexico where there was people with assault rifles, and they didn't know why they were bringing them there, and they left them there. And these folks that were there with assault rifles were there to assault them, to rob them. It was so horrific that she described that they physically made them take off all their clothes, including the grandmother, and that they sexually assaulted not only her but her daughter. And it was only when the daughter started screaming that she was pregnant and screaming because they threatened to kill them if they didn't give them any money, that they finally released them after threatening them to kill them. But they took off their clothes, they assaulted them sexually, including a grandmother. Can you imagine that? And that was her horrific journey to seek refuge, to come and free the violence in El Salvador, in that area, which is known as the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, that are some of the most dangerous countries in the world. At one time, there were 1, 2, and 3 rated the most dangerous countries in the world. But that was her, when she described that, that really, really hit me. Very graphic, how horrific somebody would do something to dehumanize them and then to assault them sexually, including a grandmother. That was very graphic. And this was a lady that came with her whole family freeing, and it was one of the families that we helped sponsor. We were able to help get out her son-in-law out of the Atlanta detention center, because when they came and they turned themselves into the border, this is how horrific our policies is. You got somebody freeing from horrific violence, somebody now, and then they get assaulted in Mexico by criminal gangs, and then they come here and we put them in a detention center that has a horrific history of human rights abuses, right? How compassionate and how lack of compassion and lack of humanity is such policies. But anyways, we were able to get the son-in-law out, and we were able to sponsor some of the attorneys. So this was a really graphic story that really, really, really hit me real hard.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Guillermo. That's just really, really heartbreaking. And I imagine it's not that uncommon, right? I mean, you all probably hear hundreds, if not thousands, of stories like this. And I think what really struck me was what you were saying about how the journey itself of people fleeing danger, poverty, violence, the journey itself can be very dehumanizing, and it can be very traumatizing. And then folks show up here, and I would think, you know, there's the work of what you all do, and then there is so much, I think, the heart of what you do, which is how do you begin to help humanize them again and center their imago Dei, that they are children of God. And so, Jonathan, if you could just share with us, how do you feel like your work honors the humanity of migrants?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think it's really crucial to recognize the humanity of immigrants first, because so many times I think the entire immigration debate is framed by people across all political lines as a matter of charity, as a matter of, oh, can we, you know, how much can we spare for being kind or giving resources to a desperate and distraught people. And I think that is completely the wrong way to frame immigration and immigrants in general. I think it does them a disservice when we see people in our community not as collaborators and not as people who bring value and are valuable in and of themselves, without regard to what they can do for us, without regard for how much money they can bring into the economy or how much, how many services they can provide. I think we have to center ourselves in really a biblically rooted understanding of people and how they are valuable to God, without a need to prove their own merit. So we try to do this in our organization by rooting the work in that collaborative mindset, knowing that this is not a service that one group of people provides to another group of people, that, you know, there are saviors who come from privilege to help out other people who need their help. But really, we're in this together. We are part of the same community. When we talk about the families that we're assisting, again, sometimes they are part of the church itself, either integrated through the local schools, the local after-school programs, the local congregations. And when we are able to uplift them and remove these barriers that they are facing from being integrated, they contribute in other ways right afterwards. We've had one family, a woman who came to us who had been living in the U.S. for her whole life since she was a baby, was married to a U.S. citizen, was a school teacher, but she had no status of her own. And after she was able to get DACA, after she was able to get her permanent residency, her green card, she started volunteering with our organization, being able to interpret for other people as they came in for their consultations. And there was one encounter where she did not know this was going to happen. We didn't set it up this way, but somebody from her own congregation came in for a consultation, and they recognized each other. And we felt like that was a moment where we were able to see these barriers, these artificial barriers that society and the law had set up, that were even bringing up walls between two members of the same church congregation that would normally be able to call themselves family and share all these moments of vulnerability with each other, and break down another layer of these legal barriers that kept us from being together. And so the person coming in for a consultation, she told us, I feel like this is not a coincidence, that this is the Holy Spirit moving, that God has put us together. And sometimes I lose sight of that. It's not just, legal work, but this is work that we are hoping to lead to the full recognition of everyone's humanity and the full inclusion of everyone, so that we can be a part of God's beloved community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Blanca, I'd love to hear your perspective as well of, how at Abara do you all center and prioritize the humanity of the migrants that you're working with?
Well, I think one of the things is that, like you had mentioned, we are kind of like the first face, like the first people to interact on the ground. I mean, we're situated right at the border, where this is like the welcome port of entry for like thousands of people that have been waiting for the past few years, and people who have been waiting for a few months. And I think it can be very easy for us to still remain in that emergency, like, I guess, relief train of thought when we're assisting people. And like Jonathan had mentioned, like, we want to, affirm their value as people, as well as like they're not just people to be rescued, but rather they are people who are contributing to society and will be working and will be parts of our communities. And I think that's something that's really driven me personally in a lot of the projects I've engaged with. Like, for a good almost 2 years, a lot of people were stuck waiting in the shelter system of Ciudad Juarez, waiting for in the hope that some kind of immigration relief would come and they would be able to cross legally into the United States. And in that time, you had people just waiting in the shelters during COVID closures. Everything in the city was shut down. And I think one of the things for a lot of the nonprofits that were working with these shelters, are just trying to plan, how can we keep these people engaged and, keep them, encouraged to continue forward in their path. And that's the way that we kind of centered the thought about creating like English classes, creating social programs, creating like workshops for women to learn how to sew or a new skill. I mean, these are people that are not just coming into a new country asking for help, but rather new opportunities. And not everyone comes from a story of like absolute tragic horror or trauma, but rather there's just no place left for them to grow. And so they're seeking new opportunities. And that also is a valid reason to move from one place to another. And I think that's a common thought that's shared with a lot of nonprofits. Like, being able to move from one place that's distressful to a place where there's new opportunity and new growth, that's a human right. I think we all do that, you know? And so that's something that really keeps me motivated, and something that's helped me, like taught me. And I've grown also, like with the women in, particularly in our sewing workshop, like seeing these women come into a place where they're not able to go outside or seek jobs to provide for their kids because they can't leave their little kids in the shelter. Having a place for them where they can feel like they're learning and growing where they are as well. And also taking those new skills to the new communities that they're going to form. So that's been a way that our organization has been able to implement it. And we're kind of based on those principles. Like, you're valuing the person for their worth as a person. They're going to bring something wonderful to your community, and you have the choice as to whether you want to nurture it and grow from it as well, or, you know, just give handouts. So.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that perspective, Blanca, because, you know, people move for all different reasons, and humans have been moving around for as long as humans have existed. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not a strange phenomenon. It's just very much a part of what it means to be human, is to go to different places, to seek new opportunities, to, you know, if you're not thriving in one place, to find a different place where you and your family can thrive. And so I so appreciate what you all do to help facilitate that for families. Guillermo, I love what your organization does with, you know, a lot of advocacy work, engaging of churches, engaging communities to try to get them to come around immigrants. And so what is your message for folks who are not immigrants themselves, or maybe, you know, there were immigrants in their family line, but it was generations ago, and so they don't feel very connected to the immigrant experience? Why should they be concerned about the issue of immigration, about the plight of migrants trying to enter the country, as well as immigrants who are already here?
Well, I think for me, you know, you cannot be disconnected from the suffering of other people. They're part of our humanity. They're part of our they're part of us. They're part of God's creation, created in God's image. You know, one of the examples that I give a lot is when Jesus was about to go through his most horrific hour of suffering, where he asked the disciples to join him in prayer. And when he came back an hour later, they were asleep. And they were so disconnected from his pain at that moment, his agony, his right. And immigrants are they are very vulnerable. If you read the scriptures in the Old Testament and New Testament, God always puts them in the category of the special protection for the orphan, the widow, and the immigrant. And I read one time Matthew Caldwell's book and Chad Myers about God is undocumented, and I like what they said about, you know, when they talked about why they were in the same category, because they're all three of them are our community are put in that category because they're all three very vulnerable to exploitation, to oppression, to abuse, right? So God goes the extra mile of saying, make sure that you connect with them, make sure that you welcome them, make sure you treat them with kindness and compassion, right? And it's not just about kindness and compassion, and as Branca and Jonathan had mentioned, it's also about justice, right? This is an issue not about sometimes about charity, but it's an issue of justice, right? That Micah the prophet says, "What does the Lord require of you to do justice?" Right? So, and it's not to do something and feel good about it. It's to acknowledge their humanity, that they are my neighbor, they are my brother, my sister, my father, my mother, my aunt, my cousins, right? And God, and when you're seeing an immigrant, when you're working, when you're in that space with an immigrant, when you're advocating with them together, amplifying that voice for justice, because they do have a voice. Some people say, well, we speak for those who don't have a voice. No, they do have a voice, you know. But are you listening, right? So are we listening with compassion, with empathy, and right? And so they do have a voice, and the cry of the immigrant, the suffering of the immigrant, the oppression of the immigrant is the cry of God. If you want to see God, where you're going to see God? you're going to see them in the face of an immigrant, because, and even the New Testament goes a little further when that they could come in the form of an angel. You want to see God, you go into that space of pain and suffering with the oppressed, with the orphan and widows, the immigrants. If you want to be in the presence of God, you got to be with the immigrant. You got to be in that space. You got to connect. I mean, there's a lot of oppression in the world. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of right. But since we're talking about the immigrants, we cannot be disconnected from their pain, because God never disconnects from people's pain and suffering. And I think that's why God puts them in that same category, to make sure that they are treated with not only with kind and compassion, but also with justice. Yeah. So we should be connected with them. We should amplify their voice for justice, for refuge, right? For freedom. You know, those are our values, and God himself was a stranger at one time, and Jesus was a stranger. Jesus fled to Egypt, right? He fled and to hide from the death, from the threat of the king, right? So that's who God is. God is an immigrant, when you talk about connecting with them, you must base it not on the values of some politician, whether Republican, Democrat, or other politicians, but what does our value say as people of faith? And we should not also use the scripture to sometimes justify laws that oppress people, like we've done in the past in our country, right? So we cannot associate God with such things, because God is a God of justice, compassion, and mercy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a great reminder that this is very much a part of our call as followers of Jesus. I just have one last question for the three of you, which is just, I'd love to hear how working with immigrants has changed you and how you see God and others. And Blanca, maybe we can start with you.
Well, this is honestly, I think sometimes working, like, it feels like working in the trenches when you're working in the very high stress zone of like a very dangerous city. And also with a lot of people from different places all around the world. I feel like the past 2 years for me has honestly been like a whole roller coaster of emotions. It's very difficult. It felt like there were several seasons where you kind of were wrestling with God himself because of the things that you were seeing and the things that you were learning. You wrestle with your own convictions sometimes, and kind of understanding of what is human, and also coming to embrace the human for like what we are, and like learning to see how God's love for the migrant, for the immigrant, like encompasses it all. So I'm sorry, it's like a very difficult question, I guess, for me, but for me, I guess I've grown in the way that I come to understand immigrant and migrant, human being that is like a child of God. Like, we have so many different paths, and we're going to continue down different futures. And like, it's not just like the journey itself that, I guess, I don't know, puts my value in my work, but rather, I don't know, it's just really changed me to like really see beyond like the red tape of policies or structures, or like having even like certain social structures in mind when you're I guess evaluating someone's like life choices or decisions or cases, but really learning to love them and walk alongside them like at every step of the journey. And I don't know, it's kind of, for me, it's like it's deconstructed but also built back very strong, like much stronger, my love and understanding for people. If that makes sense. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I really appreciate your honesty. I think that the work is not easy, right? And so to have questions and struggles and that wrestling with God that you mentioned, that seems like that would be very much, part of the process and what God is probably calling us into when we go into these difficult places. How about for you, Jonathan? How has this work changed you and your view of God and others?
Yeah, so I was going through, as a story, I think, to illustrate how God has discipled me throughout my life and has grown me. I was going through some of my old belongings at my mom's house. She was hoarding all my old paperwork and homework from like junior high, high school. I found something I wrote when I was maybe 13 or 14 years old for a class assignment. And for some reason, I was complaining offhand about why illegals didn't follow the rules, and also complaining about maybe too many Mexicans in the neighborhood. And when I saw that, it was like one of the cringiest things that I had written, and I felt immediate embarrassment. I found it kind of funny that I had once at some point thought that, and I was wondering what could have put me in that spot in the first place. And I think around that time, it was the late 90s, and I think they were running a lot of political ads for Governor Pete Wilson, and one of them had like, they're coming and they won't stop coming, and it's a bunch of images of brown people crossing the border. And I was so young, I didn't really have any personal experience to sort of ground these ideas in, right? But they were somehow had gotten to me, and I think it was a fear of a fear of the unknown, or just a misunderstanding of the unknown, believing in stereotypes, being able to be convinced by these messages that distinguish, me from other people. And of course, over time, as part of the process of discipleship, God was able to break down those barriers, right? Those misconceptions gradually, until somehow, I ended up doing this work in kind of a complete turn of events. And I think, one of the things that happens as you grow to work with a community that you previously were, culturally unaware of, ignorant of, as you come to work with people that are going to speak differently, look differently from you, I think you undergo that same discipleship that allows you to see the world with the same eyes as Christ. And I think one of the verses that really stand out to me, Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, no male nor female, you are all one in Jesus Christ. That really, for me, that meant being able to see the world where you're not defining yourselves by these differences that are that God doesn't see. Ethnicity, your social status, those don't matter in the eyes of Jesus. You're all children of God. And that, as a reality, is really, really hard to, actually experience, because we're just told by the world over and over again that we're different. We have these irreconcilable differences. And I think that has also brought me to really challenge the idolatry of worshiping a country, worshiping a place, worshiping a particular people group over another. I've come to just see, as part of that discipleship, God teaching me, like, He's not the God of Babylon. He's not the God of Rome. He's not the God of America. He's not the God of even Israel. Part of that process, Galatians 3:28 again, and Jesus coming to the world was to extend His grace to all people and extend the family to all people. So I really have been forced to challenge even the underlying assumptions of what it means to be American. What does it mean sometimes when that conflicts with being part of God's kingdom, and the conflicting loyalties that might happen when we try to put the interests of one people, of one country, above another. So it's an ongoing process, but I think God has done a lot of great work in revealing these idolatries simply by uplifting the humanity of the people around me.
Yeah, that sounds like it's been quite a journey for you. How about you, Guillermo? Close us out with how have you been changed by this experience?
Well, similar to what Jonathan and some of the things that he said right now, that many misconceptions or many things you grew up with, including in the church also, that was taught to you. But I've been changed in many ways working with immigrants, and I always struggle also with that scripture that mostly is used by my community, evangelicals, who welcome the stranger, but it's more than that. I've learned, it's when Paul said that the greatest thing was love, that not being in that space, not supporting immigrants, not standing with them is the lack of love. And the absence of love is the absence of God, because it's spelled right there in the commandments. If you love God, you must love your neighbor as yourself, right? So I learned many things from different, using the right words. But I learned also in working so many immigrants, we touch bases and we sponsor immigrants not only from Latinx countries, but from Asia. We had a community member that was Muslim from China, who was a part of the oppression of the Chinese government on the Uyghur community, which was his story was very powerful, also really hit me, because he hasn't talked and he doesn't know what his wife and 3 children are for the last 3 years. He hasn't, and we sponsored him so he could get released from the detention center, and he went into one of our congregations, and he's Muslim, right? And myself, I'm a Christian, right? But you learn that love covers people unconditionally. You learn to be non-judgmental. You learn to welcome every immigrant as they are in their own individual gifts, challenges, their own culture, right? Because even sometimes I see other immigrants, when they interact with asylum seekers from other countries, sometimes they oppress the other immigrants too, because they expect them to assimilate, so-called assimilate. They expect them to act a certain way, right? So they lack that understanding and that empathy from an immigrant from a different country. And I've seen that happen at congregations. So you have to educate congregations. And so I've learned to listen, you have to have a lot of empathy. And then I learned that this work, you take in a lot of suffering also. You take in a lot of pain. And unlike the prosperity gospel, I'm sorry, I gotta say this, that is a very, for me, it's a very selfish gospel that says, give to God so he can give you something back. And that if you have faith, you won't suffer. I mean, all the disciples who were the greatest 12 disciples, the only disciples, every one of them paid a price for being a disciple. So when you ask God, when I ask God to use me, what am I asking him to use me for? What, let's say if I'm going to seminary or whatever, because at the end, it's not about the power or God used me to speak to thousands of people. At the end, it's the most important thing is love, the presence of love. Love covers everything. So, and love takes in suffering. So you take in a lot of suffering and in these spaces, because you hear all these horrific stories and you hear a lot of pain, and you have to learn how to have empathy. And it even changes you the way you pray, not to pray over people, but pray with people, connect with their pain, connect with their suffering. So, it teaches you, it has taught me all that, and to be in that space, not just to pray and utter words, but to actually be in that space of pain and suffering when you have to be, and then also take that pain sometimes and you have to unload it. And sometimes you can't bear it. Sometimes you say, God, why do these injustices happen, right? Why, for example, this previous administration, when they took office, a lot of immigrants were in a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. I was questioning God, like, why did you allow this person who had roots of racism and who initiated some of the most horrific policies towards immigrants, including his attorney general separating children from their parents and then quoting the scriptures, right? It makes you sick that you would associate a God who's compassion, kind, excuse me for a second here, a God that is compassion, love, full of love and empathy and justice, that you will associate God with such inhumanity, separating a parent from their children, right? But yeah, those are the things I learned. I learned that God really walks with the immigrant. God is the immigrant. God is in that space. And if I want to find God, that's where I'm going to see God. And I see God in those faces. I see God in the immigrants. I see his presence there. And I see the presence of pain, but I also see the presence of love. And that's what matters. I think at the end, love, the presence of love is where God is at.
Amen. The power of presence, the power of love. Well, thank you once again to all of you, to Guillermo Torres, Blanca Castillo, and Jonathan Fung. You all have been an incredible panel. You've shared so much wisdom and passion and your heart. I am grateful. All of us are grateful for the work that you do for our immigrant friends and neighbors, as well as for our communities as a whole. So thank you all very much. And thank you to the PAX family for joining us and tuning in. Grace and peace to all of you.